Hello everyone, welcome to the Case for Life program. We're going to go back to school today, namely freshman logic course, because we've got a progressive pastor out there named Caleb Lines who thinks he has debunked the pro-life argument once and for all, and we're going to watch him and determine if he really succeeds at it. And I think you'll see he's forgotten some of the most elementary principles of logic that he should have learned in 7th grade, but we'll analyze that. We're going to take a look at that. And the reason we're going to do that is it's seeming more and more common right now to see people use arguments that aren't really arguments, that do nothing to debunk the pro-life position and do nothing to establish a so-called right to an abortion. So I was sent this clip. Again, the pastor's name is Caleb Lines, and I don't know where he pastors, but he's a progressive pastor somewhere. And he has a clip out where he talks about why religious people like you and me oppose abortion. And his point is that if he can show why we oppose it, he can debunk our argument. Well, let's see how he does. We'll take a look at it here and see what he does. We'll just pick him up right from the beginning. I'm going to watch him here on my phone and see if we can't figure out what he thinks.
Why on earth are religious groups so concerned about this? Have you ever wondered that? Well, the answer is that they really weren't until 1978. Did you know this? That in the 1970s, after Roe v. Wade became law in 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention, the most conservative evangelical group in the United States, passed 4 resolutions in favor of a person's right to choose. Did you know this? In the 1970s, the Southern Baptist Convention was in favor of a person's right to choose. Here's what happened. When Brown v. Board of Education became law, which made it illegal to segregate schools, white folks, especially white folks in the South, began to put their children in private Christian schools. They were called segregation academies. And that way, their good little white children didn't have to learn with children of color. These were religious organizations with a 501c3 status. Eventually, that was ruled unconstitutional under the Nixon administration, and any school that was doing this would lose its 501c3 status. Now, there was this guy, his name was Paul Weyrich. You ever heard of him? He was a political strategist, and he was all in favor of using the segregation issue to get white, conservative, Southern evangelicals out to vote. When it turned out that segregation could no longer be the issue to get those folks out to vote, he started looking for another issue. And he tried several, but in 1978, he came up with this plan to try the issue of abortion. And he identified 4 midterm elections. And he sent people out with pamphlets about abortion to pamphlet church parking lots. And so they went to church parking lots, and in these close elections with Democratic incumbents and very conservative, anti-reproductive health Republicans running in very low voter turnout races, that strategy worked. And in all 4 of those elections, those anti-reproductive health candidates won the election. And they realized that abortion was an issue that would get people out to vote. It would galvanize that Southern, conservative, white, evangelical base. And so they really latched on to that. Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, didn't preach about abortion for years after Roe v. Wade became law. But in 1978, Paul Weyrich recognized that this was the issue, and so he helped Jerry Falwell found the moral majority. In fact, Paul Weyrich coined the term moral majority. And that became the issue to get people out to vote at the polls. What's abortion really about? It's really about racism. That's what it's about.
All right, let's stop it right there. That was about a 3-minute sermonette from the good pastor. Where does it go off the rails? Well, it goes off the rails right at the beginning because the entire thing commits what's known as the genetic fallacy. And this is where you fault an idea based on its alleged origins rather than by the merits of the argument itself. Now, remember his opening question. He said, why on earth are religious people so focused on abortion? And by religious people, he means conservative Christians who vote Republican. And what's his answer? Not that we have an argument for our view, but rather our roots are in racism. And how does he come to that conclusion? He says, well, religious people didn't care about abortion. Conservative Southern religious people, even the Southern Baptist, didn't care about abortion in 1978 or before 1978. Before then, they were passing resolutions affirming a woman's right to choose, as he put it. He says that after the Brown versus Board of Education decision, the Supreme Court decision in 1954, which he says wrongly forbids parents from segregating their kids from children of other races. Actually, what the decision said is that public schools could not segregate children based on race or color of skin, which is good. That's right. I agree with that. But it did not say that you as a parent couldn't put your kid in a private school if you felt that fit your worldview better, or even if you did want to avoid other races, which I would argue is not a good motivation. But the law did not say you couldn't put your kid in a public school. The minister is wrong here. Rather, it said public schools could not discriminate on the basis of skin color. Now, what's interesting is he goes on to say that really what this is all about is racism. You have white parents that at one time could be rallied to get out the vote for conservative candidates, allegedly, because you could play the segregation card. But allegedly, when under the Nixon administration, that became illegal, then they needed a new issue. And so, voila, abortion pops up. We'll make that the issue, said the conservatives, according to this pastor, Caleb Lines. And that what really happened is abortion just became a way for conservatives to practice racism. They could no longer use segregation directly because it was being declared illegal, but they could hide behind their alleged pro-life beliefs and make that their alleged issue when really what their agenda was to promote segregation. Okay? Now, let's go ahead and just look at this for a moment. Let's assume the good pastor here is absolutely right. We are all a bunch of racist. We're terrible people. We're probably misogynists too. But we only oppose abortion because we need it to kind of, give us cover for our real agenda, which is segregation, a racist agenda. Now, that's what the pastor wants you to believe. Now, I'm going to suggest you don't go after him, at least initially, on his facts. We'll get there in just a minute. But the first thing I want to do is say, okay, dude, you're right. We're all a bunch of racists. We're all misogynists. We're whatever you say we are. How does that refute our argument that abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being? You remember our pro-life argument, right? Premise 1, it's wrong to intentionally kill an innocent human being. Premise 2, abortion intentionally kills an innocent human being. Conclusion, therefore, abortion is wrong. Now, that argument stands or falls on its merits, not the motivations or the behavior of the people advancing the argument. So even if it were true that those who oppose abortion were all racist, they were all misogynists, they were all people who hated anybody but the pure white race, even if that were true, bad people can still make good arguments. And you'll note the pastor here does nothing to refute that formal pro-life argument we just went over. All he does instead is attack the alleged motives of those who oppose abortion. Now, he makes a number of factual mistakes, and we'll go ahead and go through those right now. He said that conservative Christians were not concerned about abortion until 1978. Well, this is just patently false. Yes, it's true there were denominations, mainline denominations in particular, like Presbyterian USA, Southern Baptists at the time, a mainline denomination, that were indeed pro-abortion. That is true. But it doesn't follow that the history of the church, the witness of the church through history, didn't care about abortion and did not take a position on it before 1978. It most certainly did. To give you an example, if you go back even to the Old Testament scriptures, let's start with the Old Testament, the Mosaic Law era, okay? Scripture is very clear that we are all image bearers, that all humans bear the image of God. Genesis 1 teaches that, Exodus 7 teaches that, Exodus 23 teaches that, and I could go on and on. There's scriptures all over the place. The point being that because humans bear the image of God, the shedding of innocent blood was strictly forbidden. So that left us only one question to answer. Are the unborn human beings? Because if they are, the biblical commands against the shedding of innocent blood would apply to them as they do everyone else. Now, let's go forward into the New Testament era. All right? The first Christians were essentially Jewish Christians who inherited a Jewish morality. So they would have thought about moral issues much the same way their Jewish forefathers would have. Well, what did Jews think about abortion at that time? Well, you're right if you say the word abortion doesn't appear in Scripture. You're right if you say it's difficult to find an exact Scripture that says the unborn are human, but you're going to have a hard time finding an exact Scripture saying that Americans are humans, or that Canadians are human, or the French are human. So that really doesn't help us out there. Nor does it help to say, well, the Bible nowhere condemns abortion. Well, the Bible nowhere says, thou shalt not use neighbor for shark bait, but that doesn't mean it's permissible. The hidden assumption here is that whatever the Bible does not expressly condemn, it allows. But that's a very fallacious way to argue. So what we need to do is say, what did the earliest Christians actually think about abortion? And if you look at the literature of the time that the earliest Christians were reading, in addition to the canonical books that made it into our scripture, you have them reading things like the Didache and other pieces of literature that make it very clear that abortion is immoral and forbidden. The Didache contrasts the way of life with the way of death, and abortion is put within the way of death, and it is not something that is looked kindly upon. Then you get to, let's just jump forward, you get to the churchmen like St. Thomas Aquinas and others, and they are very clear that abortion is wrong. The earliest church fathers taught that, okay? If you look at the patristic fathers, they taught that it was wrong. If you look at Basil, you look at any of them, Athanasius, all of them were uniform in their testimony that abortion was wrong, and they went so far as to say that women who get them, if they are within the church environment, should be subjected to ecclesiastical, in other words, church-grounded penalties. They didn't advocate for legal penalties, but they did advocate for church or ecclesiastical penalties for women who secure abortions. Okay, let's keep going. Now come to the Protestant reformers, and you see there everyone from Calvin to others that make it clear that abortion is a crime against humanity, a crime against the image-bearing status of the unborn, and that to rob the fetus of its life is a monstrous crime. So there you're right up through the Reformation. Let's keep going. Get to our own age. You have Dietrich Bonhoeffer in his ethics writings talking about abortion being a terrible crime that robs the child of its life and its potential. And this is not something that we are pulling out of thin air. This is one of the most respected, sought after, major current time reformers of our day who is saying this. Then you start looking at denominational statements. And I have a book in my library called Abortion in the Church. And this particular book is very interesting because it goes through all of the denominational statements on abortion. Okay, now this Caleb Lyons is somewhat correct when he says the Southern Baptists didn't come on board until 1978. That's true, but a lot of other denominations did, and they were speaking out faithfully against abortion long before 1978. So it's simply untrue that religion really didn't care about abortion until the early 80s when it became politically expedient to do so. But again, I want to grant the good pastor his point here. Let's say he's right about all of that. It doesn't refute the pro-life argument at all. He doesn't even attempt to do it. He just engages in a very elementary, fallacious genetic fallacy in trying to dismiss our actual argument. And it's something that we see again and again. Now, there's something else he does here. You'll notice that his reply is question begging because he talks about an alleged right to choose. He talks about reproductive freedom and reproductive health, something he would never do if we were talking about the killing of toddlers or 5-year-olds or maybe teenagers. Some of you are going, wait a minute, teenagers, let's discuss that one. But notice what he's doing here. These arguments, these appeals to choice, appeals to privacy, appeals to reproductive health, only work if you assume that the victim in question is not a human being. Otherwise, you're really making a rather barbaric claim. So he is assuming the unborn aren't human, but he doesn't argue for it. He presents no evidence to show the unborn are anything but human beings. He just assumes it. And this is not something that is new to the abortion debate. In fact, it's something we see again and again. I've got a book here. It's a book called Pro by Katha Pollitt. And it's interesting. I'm just going to read you a paragraph from her book and see if you can see where she's making all kinds of assumptions that she really doesn't argue for. Here's what she says. She says, quote, "It's hard to see how a fertilized egg qualifies as a person. It has no brain, no blood, no head, no organs, no limbs. It cannot think, it cannot feel, it cannot perceive or communicate. It has no character traits or relationships. It occupies no social space. It is the size of a period at the end of this sentence." Now, think about that for a moment. She appeals to all these character traits, says, well, this embryo is small. She says it can't think. She says it can't interact with its environment. It has no character traits that we would normally think of as attributing to a person. Now, the question, of course, is why do any of those things matter in the first place? Pollitt presents zero argument for it. So she may have a title of pro in her book, but she is certainly no pro when it comes to arguing for the alleged permissibility of abortion, because she gives us no reason why body size, the ability to interact with your environment, the ability to recognize patterns, and whatever else she mentions there, she doesn't give us any reasons why those things are value-giving in the first place. She just asserts that they are. And this is the kind of thing we see again and again and again when we come to people who, you know, they put up their academic credentials like they're really on top of it here, but they're making very elementary mistakes in the way that they argue. Now, we're going to take a break here in just a minute. When we come back, I want to talk about what happened in Massachusetts last week. You may remember that the governor there signed a bill stripping all protections from the unborn up through birth. And we're going to talk about that. I think there's a little bit of confusion on the pro-life side about what the real significance of this is. We'll take that up when we come back from the break. Hello, friends. You may not have time to read a full-length treatment of abortion like I've done in this book, The Case for Life, the second edition, but you may have time to take what amounts to 7 sessions, a week's worth of study if you want to do it day by day, to learn how to defend your pro-life views persuasively. We have a basic course that will help you do just that. You will learn how to make a formal case for the pro-life position. You will learn how to defend it with science and philosophy. Even with non-Christians, you can make a case for the pro-life view. Then we'll teach you how to handle objections, how to recognize the 5 bad ways people argue about abortion, and how they often bring up things that are beside the point. You'll learn to keep the main thing, so that you're in charge instead of feeling like you're in the hot seat whenever the issue of abortion comes up. Visit the website for details. Welcome back, everybody. We've been talking about bad ways people try to justify abortion, and the good pastor Caleb Lines is a category, or I should say a category of his own here. He engages in the genetic fallacy, trying to debunk the pro-life argument, and he tries to debunk it by judging the motivations of pro-life people. But you first got to show that the pro-lifer is making a bad argument before you can say why you think he's motivated to make that bad argument. You first have to show his argument is no good before you go after what his alleged motivations may be. When you fault an idea based on its origins rather than its merits, you engage in the genetic fallacy, and that is something that is utterly fallacious, and I'm surprised the pastor didn't know better. But maybe he did. Maybe he knew that most people listening to him wouldn't care or didn't know any better. But whatever, we do know better, because on this show, we make sure you can spot the faulty reasoning from the other side. Now, last week in Massachusetts, you know, the governor there signed a bill that stripped away all restrictions on abortion up until birth. And the thing that a lot of pro-lifers found disturbing was the politicians gathered around her broke out in cheers and applause when she finished signing the document. And I saw, people on podcasts saying, oh, this is just demonic. There's no other way to explain this. This is demonic. This is awful. This is an aberration. This is beyond anything we've ever seen before. And I do agree it's demonic, but I think they're missing a bigger picture here. And what they tend to think is, oh, look how strange it is, how awful that people are applauding abortion. It shouldn't strike us strange at all, given where our culture is, men and women. Our culture applauds abortion, it loves abortion, and it hates the idea of the Imago Dei. And the Imago Dei, the idea of the image of God being in man, is the foundation for the pro-life argument. Now, why do people in today's culture hate the idea of the Imago Dei? Let me tell you why. And I think this is a point that Carl Trueman brings out very well in his book, The Desecration of Man, which I commend to your reading. Trueman's point is that the minute you start arguing that humans bear the image of God, you also assume that humans have intrinsic purposes they ought to fulfill as image bearers. In other words, if we bear the image of our Maker, that entails responsibilities. It entails things we ought to fulfill in order to be image bearers. And when you start arguing that human beings have intrinsic purposes, well, that starts to put handcuffs on unfettered human freedom to invent ourselves and remake ourselves any way we want. Now, remember this, we're in a culture that thinks your gender is determined cognitively, not by the characteristics of your physical body. You might be a male in terms of your sex, your biological sex, but be a female in terms of your gender, which they define strictly in a mental sense. It's what we call body self-dualism. We've talked about it before on this show. Body self-dualism says the real you has nothing to do with your physical body. The real you has only to do with your thoughts, your desires, your aims, how you construct yourself according to your own unfettered desires. You are free to remake yourself any way you want. And by goodness, society's going to affirm that, or we're going to, have legal penalties for those who won't affirm it. That's where we are as a culture. Now, think about this for a moment. Why do people applaud abortion? Because they dislike the idea that human beings have intrinsic value. It shouldn't surprise us that they're applauding this kind of butchery in Massachusetts or anywhere. Let me ask another question. Why are red states like Montana, Ohio, Missouri, Kansas, and other states voting to put abortion rights into their state constitutions where they cannot be touched? And the answer is, even in conservative states, people like the idea of there being no limits to my freedom as an expressive individual, okay? And anything that kind of comes along and says, we're going to draw borders around what your life should look like, must not only be resisted, it must be desecrated, resisted violently, and thrown down. And so when it comes to something like this, where the pro-life view says, look, those children in the womb have intrinsic value. They bear the image of their maker. The culture goes, oh, really? We're going to fix that. And abortion's going to be the tool we'll use to fix it. Because after all, if we can have abortion up through birth, then that kind of will culturally put an end to this idea that human beings have some kind of intrinsic purpose from the time they begin to exist. Make no mistake, men and women, our culture doesn't merely dislike the pro-life view. It's not that we're not nice enough. Our problem isn't marketing. Our problem is the anthropological assumptions that people bring to the abortion debate. They don't like it when you suggest that human beings have intrinsic purposes, because that entails obligations. And when you're in a culture that thinks it is free to invent itself any way it wants, to be whatever it wants to be, and that people have a right as individuals to defy nature, defy any kind of theistic restraints on how we behave, you're going to get a culture that applauds abortion. There is a real theological problem here, that when people reject the Imago Dei, they reject any kind of limits on human nature. Now, one of the dangers here for the secularists that I don't know that they've thought through, if human nature is not fixed, neither are the natural rights that spring from that human nature, like those rights enumerated in the Declaration of Independence, the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, things like that. Rights that are pre-political, that government doesn't grant, it recognizes. If human nature isn't fixed, neither are the rights that spring from that nature. That's where we are as a culture, men and women. We're in for a long fight. Buckle up. It's not going away anytime soon.